Lauren Speranza joins us live now from Washington, D.C. She is the Director for Transatlantic Defence and Security at the Centre for European Policy and Analysis. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Lauren. Look, we'll just pick up with what we were discussing with Frank there. The UN Security Council preparing a resolution to vote against Russia, albeit Russia has a veto. So it is essentially not going to go anywhere, which just gives you an idea of how tricky it is for the UN to do anything. And NATO earlier suggesting that Russia have ideas beyond just Ukraine. How tricky is it for NATO and indeed the UN to actually take action on this situation?
Well, I think you're right that the UN is certainly constrained by Russia's position inside the organization. I think NATO has done a much better job of trying to respond swiftly to the situation. I saw in the segment just before this, you covered that NATO leaders met in an emergency meeting this morning under Article 4, where they had some consultations about what to do next to bolster security in Europe. And they did agree to send additional security assistance to Ukraine, and also to deploy for the first time in history in a true collective defense role, the NATO Response Force, or at least parts of it, which is historic and nothing to scoff at, because that means that every single NATO ally had to agree in order to deploy the NATO Response Force. And so that is a true signal that the alliance is unified and that European and the US leaders are on the same page and united against Russian aggression. And so I think NATO has been true to its mission to deter and to defend against aggression on allied territory. But where it's tricky for the alliance to really make progress is in defending Ukraine, because it's unfortunately not a NATO member.
And how about the situation regarding Article 5? What potentially would it have to take for Article 5 to be triggered? And just for those who aren't completely across what that means, just explain what Article 5 is.
Sure. So Article 5 is part of the Washington Treaty, which is the founding document for NATO, which declares that an act of aggression against one nation is an attack against all who are members of the NATO alliance. And so it's really the collective defense clause of NATO. And what it would take to trigger that would be Russia invading or incurring onto territory of an allied member state, a NATO member nation. So that could be in the Baltics, for example, or and that, I think, is a really escalatory step that I'm not convinced Putin would take. And that's part of the reason that I think he calculated he could get away with invading Ukraine, because the Article 5 guarantee of collective defense does not apply to Ukraine as a partner of NATO and not a member. I do think there is a possibility, though, the further that Russia pushes into Ukraine, the buffer between Russian forces and allied forces shrinks. And so as the fog of war thickens, it's very possible that we could have an accidental escalation where Russian forces could do something that accidentally involved NATO forces that are present in the region. And that could, of course, lead to a massive escalation. And I think that's what we're hoping to avoid.
What about a cybersecurity attack on a country like the United Kingdom or even the United States? Do you think that could possibly qualify as something that might well trigger Article 5?
Absolutely. In fact, the alliance has recently taken decisions to say that cyber attacks do qualify under Article 5, but it's unclear what level it would have to be of a cyber attack in order to trigger Article 5. And in some ways, that ambiguity helps, because it gives us flexibility and freedom to respond in different ways to different degrees of attacks. And it also keeps Vladimir Putin guessing about what would be a bridge too far in triggering a full NATO response. But it is very possible that a very severe cyber attack on a NATO country like the UK or any other nation could trigger Article 5.
And as for defence and security in that region of Eastern Europe, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, said earlier that they believe Russia's objectives are not limited solely to Ukraine. I mean, I know it's anyone's best guess as to what's in Vladimir Putin's head right now, but what would your assessment be of that?
Well, I think it's clear that Putin has broader ambitions than even we thought a few days ago. But he's been clear about these all along, that this is not just about Ukraine. It's not just a question of NATO membership. This is about Russia's place in the world and the broader European security order. And I think it's very possible, depending on how things go in Ukraine, that Putin could target other countries. I'm thinking of Moldova or Georgia, other countries where he has already tried these salami-slicing tactics of trying to occupy small pieces of territory in these countries to try and prevent them from integrating further with the West and try to reestablish his sphere of influence in the region that was formerly the Soviet Union. And so I think it is possible that he will not just stop with Ukraine. And even if it doesn't happen immediately after this war, our response matters, because he will certainly come back pushing for more, depending on what we let him get away with this time. So we definitely need to be clear about our response to deter further wars like this in the future.
Great to get your thoughts, Lauren. Appreciate you coming on the program.